The definition of scorn is a feeling and expression of contempt and disdain for someone or something. The title of the game says so much for simply 5 letters, as it accurately portrays the thoughts and the feelings of both the player and character. It is no secret that the reception to the game has been mixed since release. Perhaps this was the plan all along, as if the title wasn't just the disgusting nature of the visuals, but rather a commentary on people's reaction to a story void of, well, story. Scorn is an immersive horror experience. If nothing else, the beauty and the tragedy of this world is what enticed players to it, and whether or not you follow along with the environmental storytelling, or the lore hidden well away in the confines of cut content, i.e. the art book, it's hard to deny that this world is fascinating through the biomechanical architecture everywhere you look. Scorn is dripping with creativity, but that isn't limited to just the visual department. Since the release, players have criticised the clunky nature of the mechanics as well as the structure of the game. Scorn is not a survival horror game. Although the player is handed 4 different weapon types in which 3 require separate ammo to use, it is not an FPS. I can imagine people viewing Scorn in the same way as Alien Isolation or Biohazard, a true survival horror with item management, crafting and stealth mechanics. None of these factors are in Scorn, thriving instead on suspense built through subtlety and patience, as stated by Doug Bradley in the official gameplay trailer.
A hidden fauna sleeps within the underbelly of the world, wanting nothing more than to be left undisturbed.
In other words, stop treating this like a shoot 'em up. Don't shoot the creatures. This is an ecosystem of infection and decay desperately clinging to the final remnants of a world lost to time. So just leave it alone. The combat is clunky. The controls are clunky. Reminds me of that Outlast walk, you know. But does that make it genuinely disappointing? I fail to see how it does. Horror games are not known for having the greatest mechanics or controls. Hell, Outlast gets away with such simple AI that you can run around in a circle while your pursuer is acting like a mirror image, imitating every move you make, never deviating or thinking for itself. But Outlast is hailed as a classic in modern horror gaming, through its brutal use of gore and tense jumpscare nature, because it builds that tension. Scorn is the same, although personally I believe that Scorn achieves this sense better than Outlast, as Outlast is, well, Outlast. The main aspect of Scorn is that it's a puzzle box simulator. Essentially, within 5 locations, Ebb Software constructs environments which force the player to stop and take it all in. The density of each level is absolutely incredible. The game itself isn't very long. In truth, you could beat the entire experience in 4 hours. And this is why Scorn is a great horror experience. A horror game should be short and sweet. Keeping one tone throughout, the developers were able to focus on one aspect alone: dread. The game is not scary. It's not even that tense, but the world puts you on edge through the aspects of trying to survive in an environment where it's painfully obvious you no longer belong, and you probably never did. The puzzles range from good to okay. There isn't anything too head-scratching in the game at all. Although saying that, I spent the first hour of my 4-hour playthrough in the first room, as the architecture blended so well with the contraption I was meant to interact with, I missed it completely. This isn't a criticism, it's mainly my ineptitude for seeing what's right in front of my nose. I will be spoiling the game in its entirety, so if you wish to click off, this is your chance to do so. I'll quickly go over each segment and explain the ins and outs of the chapters and how this relates to the overall message of the game. The beginning of the game has you playing as a nameless protagonist who falls directly into a chasm from the top of the city, which places you in an incubation area, I think. It's hard to determine what some rooms are used for. The sprawling environment allows you to become accustomed to the controls before solving the first puzzle. A simple car park affair where you have to direct the correct egg to the incubation pod. Nothing too challenging. You are then greeted 2 options. 1. Take the specimen you've just pulled down and scoop his body away, leaving a hand. 2. You can cut the egg open on the other side, birthing the embryo. Both options are viable. However, each show a very drastic way of dealing with the egg. This opens the door to trying to understand the 2 forms of process within this world. One which is so barbaric, and the other which at first feels horrific but then subverts their expectation. This to me screams this civilization thrived on natural selection. If you were not good enough, you were chucked to the depths. My favourite detail to this contraption is that both don't work properly, showing the aged nature of this world. The technology hasn't been used in possibly thousands of years, which is conveyed beautifully through the simplistic but poignant environmental storytelling. If you take the arm off the poor soul, you can then insert a key contraption to the flesh just like your own to open a door, and then progress using your own means. The second is way more interesting to me, and once again shows the screwed up ideology of the world the character resides in. Upon birthing the body, it stumbles in a beautiful demonstration of an infant learning to stand. The animation is crafted to show the scared nature of the body as it's being born, while also being so agonisingly long that it begins to infuriate the player. I view this as a commentary on how the strong are separated from the weak. As if by instinct, as soon as the being reaches the key contraption, it falls unable to walk, through the strain of learning under such quick circumstances. Your character then drags the body with no regard for its well-being and places the hand in the machine, converting the being into simply a tool. The lack of sympathy from the character can convey 2 points. 1. The character understands this world and its inhabitants to realise that everything is simply a means to an end. Or 2, the player has just been born and is going off its primal instinct to progress. The process continues with a painfully slow stumbling walk to the door contraption as you once again, with no care or delicacy, drag the poor soul's body across the ground and stick him into the mechanism. You then open the door and leave without another thought. I think this encounter is absolutely brilliant. It's essentially a learning tool for the rest of the game, forcibly telling the player, you can take the easy way out, but you will not get the full experience of what the developers were trying to craft. This to me is the perfect allegory for the gun combat. The frustration through both the character and the player is a symbiotic relationship, as both are in tandem with one another, which sets a precedent for the rest of the game going forward. Continuing this sense of natural selection, the first thing you see in the next area is a heap of discarded bodies which appear to have fallen down a chute, almost as if this place is a dump or a factory farm. The farm comparison continues through the nature of the beings who look as if they're caring for the crops in this area by spraying the pillars. The pillars in question appear to be constructed of bone, originating from the humanoid beings possibly discarded down, judging by the multitude of corpses piled up. Either those who are weak do not survive the selection process, or the outdated technology cannot contend with the amount being born essentially. These could be where they're stripped down and converted into these pillars being cared for. The pillars themselves seem to be an amalgamation of multiple beings due to the bone sizes and overlapping nature. The middle of the pillar seems to be a build-up of crushed up flesh and blood, the same texture of the wires which have been sprawled across the entire landscape of the world. So, what does this all mean and why should I care? Well, you only care if you want to care. Again, showing scorn to everything you see and do will eventually lead you to ruin and failure. My estimation is that the rejects are taken to this room and crushed down by what appears to be an oil pump, almost as if the blood has been pumped from the body to power the rest of the city. After all, the purpose of this room is for the player to open the screens to progress, which is only achieved through inserting a battery essentially into the monolith at the centre of the room, which then send the farmers out to care for the pillars. If you were to compare how the rejects look to the embryo in the previous room and yourself, they're colourless, losing all features almost as if drained dry like a milk jug and left to be discarded. Next to the bodies is essentially a cart carrying them away but has long been abandoned like the rest of this world. Whether the bodies became fertiliser or something else, I have no idea. Behind the chute, you will find your first weapon, which we'll call the Prodder. The most interesting thing about each weapon is their design, almost clip-on points for the one single tool, the trigger. It is worth noting that the gun is also connected via the same blood tube, almost as if it's being fed through it. I say fed, as after disconnecting the gun, the same flesh colour as the pillars is wriggling around almost like a sentient flesh within. This will become more significant through later chapters of the game. The Prodder's charge move is so agonisingly slow, as well as the waiting time to use it again. It is obvious that this is not what it was made for as an offensive weapon, but rather a key for contraptions, which is what you'll use it for. Sometimes. Although the character does use it in an offensive means, it's terrible. And I think that's the point. Your first kill doesn't feel natural, it feels as if you've accidentally succeeded in something you really shouldn't have. Upon inserting the third and final battery, the strain is too much on the outdated technology and all the screens release and the monolith explodes, sending you to the floor with it. Your player is then drenched in the liquid spilled across the floor and supposedly is never seen again. I love this whole chapter. The meticulous attention to detail on everything is to be commended, as well as keeping true to the atmosphere bleeding off the screen. This has helped enormously through the dreary lighting. The pale green nature compelled through small strip lights essentially on the floor gives this sense of alien to the whole place. The inspiration taken from H.R. Giger, best known for his work on the 1979 film Alien, is apparent in every corner of the game, but rather than a cheap way of using the iconography to sell the product, the game uses the style to influence its own ideas. This doesn't feel like the Engineer's world in Covenant or the look of the Xenomorphs throughout the series. The look and feel of the game is its own identity, which is woven throughout each frame of the environment. A solid departure to the start of Act 1. The second chapter begins with a tight space looking into what appears to be a brain, the centre of everything. The player is forced away from the site as they're dropped from a great height, crash landing next to the deceased remains of another humanoid creature. The player removes their own umbilical cord and stands rather quickly, I might add, compared to the embryo of the beginning of Chapter 1, almost showing this sense of natural birth or the process of evolution through a more advanced being than the egg hatchling. The area around the character is barren, wasteland of death and decay, so let's just call it the barren field or field of decay. This is primarily a walking simulator area, where the player takes in everything around them, unburdened by the perils of the world later discovered. It is clear immediately that this wall appears to be a trial of some sorts in which the creatures have to navigate their way to their purpose in life, like the main character. This area is a stark contrast to the rest of the industrial biomechanical landscape of the rest of the game. Sure, it has archways and the massive building in the distance, but the field is barren. The pale, almost lifeless pink colour encapsulating the area makes it feel as if your surroundings are almost untouched by society, and as a result still feel pure. The only obstacle in this section is the beginning of the infectious flesh which bleeds its way across the empty canvas. The dark dry blood of red of the flesh disturbing the peace and quiet of the landscape is intoxicating. This is the first instance where the player sees the substance in a large mass, and it screams at you to look at it and take it all in. The area appears to be a metaphor at the lack of guidance we all have at birth. Without a parent to guide us, we are lost, destined to wander aimlessly through a path of life, desperately trying to discover a purpose to our existence. And this scene creates this feeling perfectly. The game allows you to soak in the atmosphere before wrenching you right back into the experience with an eyesore, which is the human factory as I like to call it. Contrast with the dark architecture invades your sight completely, and like the character, you're drawn to it. It also is the exact same structure of the opening cutscene before you fall into the incubation room. After leaving this area, I surveyed the environment I was now in. Thanks to the memorable design of the game, I was able to deduce that this was the position of the outside of the structure I was exploring in Chapter 1. The realization that the character from the beginning was in the same boat as our new character, except they fell deep into the previous chapter. I think it's interesting at the difference between the two characters through the rough way in which the previous character acted compared to this new one. It shows this juxtaposition of how possibly the strong do not survive, despite what the civilization would like you to believe, considering the first died early on whereas the second has already progressed further than their predecessor. It's an interesting philosophy of subverting the trope only the strong will survive. But I've analysed way too much of Chapter 2 already, so I'll run through the rest as fast as possible. The player progresses into the building as the entrance crumbles away to show the creature scuttle in the darkness. Lovely. Following the route, you gain access to a room with 4 red pods which are suspended. The aim of this area is to collect the 4 keys to open the pods to access the master key to the doors of this world. Nothing really happens in between finding the contraptions to essentially collect a bead for your tool. I have to comment on how great this visual puzzle looks though. It does look so satisfying. The only thing to talk about really is the bridge system. It's simple but visually incredible. The way both sides connect together is super interesting, as if two flesh sacks have connected and you're in the hollowed centre. It feels alive, which again adds to that disgusting nature of the world. Upon reaching the lower level of the area, the player is once again encountered by the creature after securing another bead, except it climbs over you and digs straight into your abdomen, becoming one with you. Surprisingly, it had the prodder attached to its tail. This leads me to believe that this creature took control of our previous character after he collapsed. Or the previous character mutated into this creature after being swallowed by the substance surrounding the body. The gun is still attached to the creature throughout your time with it. The whole game even. Confirming the theory that the infectious disease throughout the land was used like the flesh of the humanoid creatures to power the city. It's essentially a tool. Everything seems to revolve around the flesh, which is both a tool and a hindrance to the world. This will become very relevant when we reach chapter 4. So after securing all parts of the key, you insert it in the most complex puzzle in the game, focusing on a system of blocking and release. This was the only puzzle where I had to stop and think how to do it, and it's brilliant. It was super satisfying to solve the puzzle and release the master key. The lights on the key increase each time part of the key is unlocked, showing a simple progressive visual system. A really great UI moment. It's also worth noting that after when the pod is opened, a man is born. I say a man, not an embryo or a being, because it is clear this seems to be the most complex version of a birth on this planet. And it dies straight away. Typical. Act 3 diverts from the previous acts through the introduction of full-on combat. Although the puzzle aspects are built around the progression of the chapter, the departures from Act 1 and 2 is primarily in the change of gameplay from a walking simulator to a light first-person shooter. So, how is it? Well, if you return to what I was mentioning previously, the philosophy of the game is to ignore enemies and continue on to your ultimate goal. Is this perfectly executed? No. Despite what the game tells you, there are some encounters which force the player to use a weapon, which could work if the philosophy of the game is to attack if provoked, but it's not. You're told to leave the creatures alone. However, there are moments in the chapter which feels like a gotcha moment rather than a reasonable moment to encounter a monster. For example, after lifting the elevator the second time, a creature spawns in your eyesight and you're faced with 3 options. 1. Run away and wait for it to lose aggro and then continue down its current path. 2. Run around the creature as to hopefully miss its acid attack. 3. Shoot it with your weapon. One of these factors cannot exist without the other. To run past it, you have to shoot it to allow the creature to collapse to the side, destroying the passive play entirely. The first is obviously the intended way, but at this point, this style of play hasn't been very rewarding when it comes to progression. These moments can add minutes onto your playtime with waiting for the creature to leave the area so you can progress. It's just not fun. Horror games are famous for the waiting for the monster to leave so you can progress trope. It works well in Amnesia, Outlast, Soma, etc. It doesn't work in Scorn. No enemy is built to look terrifying. Most of the enemies you encounter are smaller than you, while also trying to make it seem like you should leave them alone. There is no benefit to leaving the enemies alone, like at all. I guess the only thing is you die less, obviously, because you avoid everything. But reaching this point, I had enough and I just ran for it. Act 3 doesn't feel organically built for the enemies in mind, as though they were thrown in at the last minute as an obstacle to make the player waste more time in the area. And because of it, this is the most boring act of the game. Right, so the goal of this chapter is to move the platform to one end of the structure to the other. This is achieved through passing a short but rather intuitive puzzle to collect the keys to release a section to allow the lift to be transported to the other side of the compound. Yeah. This act isn't terrible, as the puzzle is good, if not a little uninspired, as a simple light up each part contraption. Well, it is with no distractions.
Did you know that fucking Vanessa Hudgens has gained 42 pounds on her low waist? Or fucking Bill Nye cheated on his ex-wife, something like that.
What? Despite this, the art design continues to be exquisite, but that's all I can say really on this chapter. It's very green, it's frustrating, and it breaks up the gameplay for worse, not better. At least it introduces the healing stations and the ammo stations. My god, the design of both these stations are beautiful. So much time was designated to showing how these depository areas would function, and it's super satisfying to see. Possibly the most confusing act of the game. Act 4 begins with a massive creature which is hooked up to tubes, and the way you're meant to progress is to essentially kill it. Why? Don't know. Does this go against everything the philosophy of the game has taught you? Yeah, essentially. This is the most gamey area in the entire experience. What I mean by this point is that you have to release 3 doors through the creature's body and send up a mechanism to then unlock the key to using the creature as an elevator to essentially leave the area. The 3 keys in question are sized to a maze block which all join together as you rotate each one to find the solution. This feels so immersion breaking and screams you are playing a game. Puzzles in video games should primarily reflect the world they exist in. For example, Soma is very computer-based, through logical solutions involving data transfers and memory management. Resident Evil has a very puzzle-centric background, and although the puzzles can get rather ridiculous, they all fit within the confines of the world they've created. How does a ball maze puzzle fit this world? This may be a subjective point on my end, but this to me was the most lazily designed puzzle in the game. Essentially it boils down to open door, go up lift, shoot big bulky thing, get stared at and question your life choices, and at the same time decide the next takeaway you're going to order, to then finally use all 3 to have the lift rise, leaving the area. That's Act 4. The only noteworthy moment you're going to get in this is that you grab a shotgun that can take down big bulkies in 2 shots. According to the lore, this massive creature is the source of the infection running through the world of Scorn, but personally, I feel that it conveys that feeling very lightly indeed, as each time you hurt it, it doesn't spawn in more enemies or become more aggressive, it just sits there. This then tells the player that this is simply a resident of the world rather than the main cause of the death of the civilization. So why are we killing it? Why is it hooked up? Probably to contain it, obviously. Through the dying nature of the world, the older technology failed and it leaked out, spreading the corruption as far as it could. Maybe it doesn't pose any philosophical questions or the meaning of life or the purpose of consequences and actions. It's simply a big fat thing in the way and you must destroy it. I guess you scorn at it, which drives home the point, or it scorns at you. Basically going off your primary goal instead of thinking about the ramifications of what this creature is going through. That's probably what the devs intended through the long gazes at the player, as if to say, why? Yeah, sorry mate, the game made me go on a fetch quest and use you as a corridor. I needed to complete a children's maze to lift you, kill you, and never think of you again. Yeah, see ya. That's essentially how I view Act 4. The upside of this act is that the phenomenal use of sound design, my god, it's beautiful. The scuttling of the creatures, the hallowing pain felt from the creature contrasting heavily with the use of mechanical machinery. It was nice to finally see the source of the biomechanical engineering of the game though. I'm guessing due to how the final act looks, this was a very bad transition to the final act, which is complete departure. Easily the most polished and interesting part of the game is the finale. It was important to be so negative on Act 4 due to the lack of bioengineering in the final area, demonstrating that the creature was indeed the source of the blood tubes, the infection, and the harmony between the two. This world was crafted with the same source, which would lead to its downfall. Is it technically the creature's fault that this happened? Or was it those who used the creature for its capabilities? These were interesting questions that were raised outside of the chapter, and with hindsight to ask, in the moment these questions don't even present themselves in Act 4, which is why the execution is flawed in that specific act. But swiftly moving on, the player is taken on this train which takes them to the high society of the world of Scorn, showing a civilization built around the purpose of worship and faith, while also taking some notes from Geiger's use of sexual imagery and reproduction. Massive statues were erected, pun intended, of men with very large Well, you get the idea. Men and women showing the process of conception, basically. I need to comment on how drop-dead gorgeous this whole chapter is. The decaying nature of this once sacred ground has been abandoned, lost to the nature of those who dared to travel further than what was intended of them. The added particle effect of the statues crumbling away is beautiful. Small touches like this allow the world to feel more alive, keeping the immersion intact. Like Geiger, the developers view the art of birth to be rather distasteful, as referenced in Geiger's popular work titled Birth Machine, showing which look to be embryos being shot out of a handgun. The commentary being, we have no choice in whether we are born or not, we just simply are shot out and have to find our purpose in life. Scorn has also taken this philosophy into the narrative as afar, with the birth of our character finding purpose in the world as they brave the obstacles they are dealt. The statues are stunning, but they don't paint this place in a welcome context, but rather an intrusive, uncomfortable, as if this shrine is to sin or the last step to salvation. And the last step cannot be accomplished alone. I wish to ignore the constant reminder of your failure in the form of the parasite which clawed its way onto you in Act 2. Throughout each act, this creature is dug further and further into your flesh as it mutates your very being, as each of those scripted sequences drain the player's health as if the creature is in tandem with the immersion of the mechanics. It's brilliant, but without it, you would not have made it this far. This creature is the reason you can use any of the weapons, and its very existence is a driving force of the power of each gun you wield. It is interesting though that your path to salvation is reliant on your ability to submit yourself through suffering. Almost like a pilgrimage where the player must carry this creature in order to understand its meaning and the meaning of the inner self. Upon entering the temple, if you will, you are greeted to one of the best vistas in the game. A beautiful purple neural network hanging from the ceiling as pinned beings have their minds joined to the construct above. Carvings on the wall depict conception as well as isolation and silence. These three philosophies seem to govern the nature of the civilization, though at the beginning the use of the natural selection could relate to the will of those who were born, as the carvings show a culled adult similar to that of the embryo which is also depicted. But this mural conveys in my eyes the duty of reproduction. Upon the edges, two adults are culled separated apart, and as we move closer to the centre, a being is shown placing their hands on the mouth of both beings, then another on the chest and stomach, and after they meet, two children are born from their conception, leading to the two embryos at the bottom as the cycle begins anew. The second mural is more interesting in my opinion, as it details what looks to be the parasite which has been classed on you throughout the majority of the game. Upon each side is a being. The first is of a person whose stomach has been torn open. The other is a person with no face and a large bump at the front. This will make no sense yet, but it will later. Leaving this perplexing area, you head downstairs where two beings are positioned on a table. These beings look identical to the bump being on the right side of the carving. Taking one of the canisters, you head down a path where you're greeted by a mechanical puppet almost, just sitting there. Grabbing a glowing red egg, you take it over to the machine which activates it as the creature scrambles unable to move. You kill the creature and take the remains to the door contraption outside where the blood is deposited into the canister. As you then repeat this exchange 3 times, it gets more annoying as it goes on. The other two have the puppet move and fight you, making a makeshift boss battle, if you will. The fight is fine, if not a little clunky and repetitive. The third is a lot better, as it's over quickly after gaining the grenade launcher, which essentially one-shots the foe. The puppets have heads which dangle off from the top of the body, showing that these are reanimated corpses that are controlled due to the substance given off from these little creatures. It's interesting to note that this is a second power source in the game, as the infection is nowhere to be seen in this chapter. I found these minions to be incredibly interesting as a concept, almost as if a direct response to the natural selection process. These beings inhabit the dead as vehicles rather than using them as a used battery, which allows them to work in unison with one another. It's an interesting philosophy of the differences of cultures and their approach to how death should be represented. The minions view death as a tool to use in physical sense, whereas the rest of the game has implied that once you die, you're donated to grow the city, nothing more, nothing less. Rather than being used, you're a cog in the system. After the boss battle, the parasite begins its final phase as it mutates your hand, leaving you stuck holding the grenade launcher and unable to interact with anything. What follows is possibly the most eye-opening portion of the game. The final area depicts a rather horrific display of engineering as contraptions are used to cut the infection off your arm, as your character audibly shows the stress of the procedure before the infection spreads across the hand once more. In these fleeting moments, you're forced to open doors and break contraptions in order to gain access to the final key of the game, which leads to an operating table. The precursors built the place, as was predicted, to remove the parasite from the body. As the contraption is designed, they knew that you'd need it, leaving the player in this state as the carving showed, the stomach exposed as you limp back to the neural room. You essentially become a tool for the rest of the journey, just like the scattered dead across the entire game. Passing a pregnant statue with the same shade of red as the eggs of the small creatures as her womb, I find it interesting that the red for the infection is conveyed through the womb, almost as if, like Geiger's work illustrates, maybe it should never have been released. The fact that the statue is obviously positioned there for significance, again, reinforcing this sense of reproduction, but it's unclear whether or not the statue represents right or wrong. Red is used to illustrate infection and danger in this game. So what does the womb convey? Sin? Natural birth? Reaching the two beings once more, you deposit the last canister as you're lifted to the centre of the room, with a massive door, and the carvings of what look like the two beings with blades for hands, and the silhouette of the creature which stuck to you. The head resembling the top of the carving. It is worth noting that these beings share the same red womb as the statue, almost as if this is a construct which is man-made, trying to break the cycle of birth from an egg and instead the process of conception, the cure for this world, a natural birth. You are presented with an option to place yourself at the centre plinth. What follows is the most graphic part of the game, where your character is bound to the neural network and as a result can then manipulate both the beings laying on the table. The design of this horrific moment is absolutely stunning. The surgeon robot using its blade hands looks like the Hindu god Durga, who wields weapons using both to destroy or create, like an incision from a surgeon. Just a thought. So after taking control of the beings, it removes one of the limbs off the surgeon, which continues to cut into your body. It then picks you up and carries you to the door. At this point you can access a second being in order to give it another keyblade to open the big door on two fronts, one from standing on the pressure plate, the other turning the handle. As the door opens, you walk forward. You lose all control of the character as the game continues you down this path, as the statues can be seen with faces played by what looks like the infection as it escapes from their faces. But up the stairs, a strange grey light illuminating the area can be seen. Is this it? Enlightenment? The answer to everything? Salvation? Well, you'll never know. Due to the ruined nature of the world, the contraption couldn't hold the parasite as it finally latches onto you as you try to reach it. But no luck. You infuse with the creature, becoming one symbiotic being as the infection spreads through the once sacred ground, as the last essence of this world dies along with the answers to their very existence. A pointless life ruled by desire to succeed and ultimately fail. Scorn ends as it begins, confusing. But if you ignore the lore represented in the art book, the nature of this game is purposely perplexing, as life would be without a guide. You're born in this world without knowledge or purpose and must find one. And ultimately, that purpose didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. I think it's a poetic take on the fixation people have to desperately try to find meaning in their existence. But ultimately, Your life is what you make of it. If you let preconceptions of society and duty define your existence, you may achieve the goal that was set for you, but was it what you ultimately wanted? I think this is what Scorn conveys in its narrative. The murals depicts this creature being essential to the process of achieving what the precursors needed, as the centre of the second carving illustrates two heads at the bottom, both of that of the character and the possessed being, but a third is within the mix which wasn't intended: the first player. The creature is first encountered after you see the first player be drowned in substance in Act 1. Upon taking control of you, a head can be seen infused onto the parasite. It is only at the end with the removal procedure that it shows the same eyes as the first player. Whether or not this parasite is the first player or simply infected them is left to interpretation. But the first player is shown to be ruthless with its lack of empathy to anything in this world. So how do you think it would react to the being who would succeed them? It is my belief that this parasite is the first player, and through his tampering with the infection has muddled the genome, resulting in the abomination which will linger at the edge of civilization for all eternity. What this world ultimately conveys is that the strong may survive, but will eventually destroy everything around them through their disgust. By treating this world with no respect or vision, it eventually tarnishes anything left to care about, paying the ultimate price for misguidance and shortcomings as everything dies along with the hope of purpose and duty. Scorn is a great experience which gets muddled halfway through. Acts 3 and 4 do so much damage to the message as well as the intrigue to this world. It is because of this fact that the reception has been so mixed on the game. People's frustrations begin with Act 3 through the combat and repetitive nature of the chapter, and I can't blame them. The disdain continues through Act 4, which, as stated before, is the worst act of the game. Through this rather large chunk of mediocrity, the finale can either feel slow or alien to what came before, to where players can't be asked to continue on. But it is annoying, because the start and end of this game conveys so much through no dialogue and opens the doors to so many questions of the meaning of life and the purpose of our very existence, and at the end, does it really matter? This was one of my favourite games of the year due to how it made me think, as well as the art direction being so unique in the gaming landscape. The score being so foreboding while not being so intrusive, the atmosphere is dripping off the walls in this game, and I really hope that Ebb Software get the recognition they deserve for this aspect. But the combat is the crux to the entire experience and would be way better off experienced if it was simply a walking simulator. But as it stands, the story of Scorn creates an open-ended canvas for players to either latch onto or ignore completely. It's essentially dictated on whether or not you want to participate in the experiment. But I wanted to, and over 3 playthroughs I have crafted a narrative which I believe the developers were trying to convey. I'll never know if I was right in my assessment of the story, or if this is literally a game where a weird sexual machine sucks you off. But either way, Scorn has no purpose. But should that mean it isn't a worthwhile experience? Thanks for watching. I'm working on something at the minute which is taking an incredibly long time, but for the meantime, I made this because I thought there was something to be said. Whether or not it was any good, well, yeah, you could be the judge of that. But as a sneak peek, I'll leave you with this. In the spirit of this teaser, go check out Papa Luge's experience for the first time, suffering through the path of pain. It's a good watch. Seriously, check it out. I also just want to say a massive thank you to absolutely everyone who watched the LEGO Star Wars video. Seriously, I can't thank everyone enough. It's honestly been an insane experience, as I just wasn't expecting anything to come of my small little video, and then it just blew up. So I thank you ever so much, and I hope that you continue to either enjoy that game or not. Is entirely up to you. That is the beauty of debating these things. There's so many different interpretations which make these videos worthwhile. So once again, thank you.